The light that came to the Arizona Territory in 1878 was not gentle. It did not ease over the horizon with soft pinks and ambers. It was a blade. It came sharp and white, slicing the high desert open, exposing the pale gray dust and the skeletal ribs of the Ocotillo. For Eli Mercer, this light was the only clock he kept. He was out before it crested the Cerro Blanco ridge, his boots kicking up small, apologetic puffs of alkali dirt. Dust Creek Homestead was a generous name for what it was: a tight, two-room cabin of raw timber, a lean-to barn that shuddered in a strong wind, and a stone-lined well. It was all fenced by 3 strands of wire, a line Eli walked every 3rd day. He carried a leather bucket holding staples, a few lengths of wire, and a heavy tool that was both hammer and pincer. His shoulders were stooped, not from the weight of the bucket, but from a permanent defense against the world. Eli was 24 years old, but he moved with the caution of a man twice his age, a man who had learned that attention brought only pain. Ocotillo Bend, the nearest cluster of saloons, feed stores, and judgment, was a full day's ride. Eli had not made the trip in over 4 months. He did not need whispers. He did not need the looks that lingered on his patched denim, or the way conversations stopped when he entered the general store. He had what he needed: his father's rifle, a small patch of stubborn nopal, and a silence so deep it had become his only companion. He worked his way south along the fence line, his eyes on the wire, his hands methodical. He checked the tension, reset a post loosened by the night's chill, and rewound a snapped wire, his motions precise and practiced. This was his world. The creak of leather, the scrape of stone, the metallic ping of the wire. He understood this. It made sense. He was halfway to the southern marker, his head down. When the hair on his arms lifted, it was not a sound. It was a change in the air, a weight. The morning sounds, the distant caw of a raven. The skitter of a lizard had not stopped. They had been replaced. Eli lifted his head slowly. 50 yards away, on a low knoll topped by the silhouette of a single, ancient saguaro, was a rider. It was a woman, an Apache woman. She sat on a lean pinto, and she sat without a saddle, as if she had grown from the horse's spine. She was perfectly still, a statue carved from the same red rock as the bluffs behind her. The new sun, just clearing the ridge, struck her, setting the fringe on her buckskin sleeves ablaze with light. Eli's breath hitched. His heart, usually a slow, predictable drum, gave a hard, painful lurch against his ribs. He had seen Apache before, but always at a distance, moving shadows on the far side of the Mesquite Wash, or solitary figures in Ocotillo Bend, standing apart, wrapped in a silence more profound than his own. He had never been this close. He had never been the subject of their attention. She did not move. She just watched. Eli's hand, slick with a sudden, cold sweat, fumbled the hammer pincers. The tool felt alien in his grip, heavy and wrong. He wanted to look away, to return to his fence, to pretend she was not there, but he could not. Her stillness held him. He looked back at his wire, pretending to check a staple. His hands were shaking. He could feel her gaze on him, a physical pressure against his skin. It was not the fence she was studying. She was measuring him. He felt a prickle of the old, familiar shame. She would see what the townsfolk saw: a reclusive, shy farmer, a man barely holding on, a man his father had once called too soft for this land. He was being weighed, and he knew he would be found wanting. He forced himself to stand straight, to turn and face her. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. As if his movement were a signal. She moved. In one fluid motion, she swung her leg over the pinto and slid to the ground. The horse stood, unbound, untethered, as still as she had been. She walked toward him. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. Her pace was even, the ground seeming to yield to her moccasins. With every step, Eli's world shrank. The vast, open desert compressed. The sky pulled taut. The only things that existed were the 50 yards of dust between them, and the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. She stopped at the fence, not 10 feet from him. He could see her clearly now. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps his own age. Her black hair was parted in the center, pulled back tightly. Her face was strong, her jaw set with a quiet, unyielding determination. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark, blacker than the bottom of his well, deep and still and knowing. They were like the sky just before the monsoon, holding the promise of lightning and flood. She looked at him, and in her gaze, there was no pity, no contempt, no curiosity. There was only purpose. Eli's throat was dry. He tried to swallow, but his tongue was a piece of wood. The woman raised her hand, not in greeting, but as if to test the air between them. She laid her palm flat on the top rail of his fence, the rail he had just steadied. The contrast of her brown skin against the sun-bleached wood was stark. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It was soft, with a low, gravelly texture, like water moving under stone. But it carried in the silence, as solid as the rock beneath his feet. "My name is Nasha Tenawi." She said it simply, a statement of fact. Eli could only nod. He felt his head make the small, jerky motion. He could not have spoken if his life depended on it. Nasha Tenawi did not look away. Her eyes held his, and she did not blink. She seemed to be reading something deep inside him, past the fear, past the defenses, down to the very marrow of his bones. Then she spoke again, the same quiet, rock-solid tone. "I want a child from you." The words hung in the air. They did not seem to make sense. They were a language he did not speak. The hammer pincers slipped from his grasp. He didn't even feel them go. They hit the dry earth with a dull, heavy thud, a muffled sound that seemed to break the morning apart. A small cloud of dust rose and settled. Eli flinched. He tried to take a step back, to put space between himself and this impossible moment. But his heel hit the very post he had been inspecting. He was trapped, pinned between the wood he had hammered and the woman who had just undone his world. The desert vanished. The sky was gone. His entire universe had collapsed to the few feet of space between them. He could smell the faint, clean scent of sage coming from her, and the sharp, coppery smell of his own fear. He stared at her, his mouth open, his mind a white, roaring blank. Nasha Tenawi watched him. She saw the panic. She saw the collapse. She saw the man fall away, leaving only the raw, trembling animal. Her expression did not change. She had said what she came to say. She took her hand from the fence rail. "I will return tomorrow," she said, her voice still quiet, still cutting through his paralysis. "Think on it." She did not wait for an answer. She turned, her back straight, and walked to her pinto. She mounted in that same, single, fluid motion. She did not look back. She nudged the horse, and it turned, moving not with a gallop, but with a steady, ground-eating pace. Eli Mercer stood frozen, his back pressed against the fence post, watching her go. He watched as she crested the knoll, past the saguaro, and disappeared into the glare of the rising sun. She was gone. He was alone again. But the silence she left behind was different. It was loud. It was ringing. It was full of her words. He looked down at the hammer pincers lying in the dust. Slowly, his body beginning to tremble, he bent to pick it up. The metal was already warm from the sun. He did not finish the fence line. He left the hammer where it fell, walked back to the cabin, and bolted the door. Night found him in the same position, sitting at the small, three-legged table his father had built. The cabin was a single room, filled with the shadows his oil lamp cast. The light was weak, a small, flickering yellow circle in a vast, encroaching darkness. Outside, the wind had risen. It was a high, thin sound, scraping against the corrugated tin roof, a lonely noise that made the silence inside feel heavier. The only other sound was the clock. It sat on the rough-hewn mantel, a small, rosewood box with a brass face. It had been his mother's. It was the only delicate thing he owned. Its ticking was sharp, precise, cutting the silence with a metallic regularity. Tick, tick, tick. Each second was a nail being hammered into the quiet. He had not eaten. He had not moved. He just sat, listening to the wind whine and the clock measure out the passing of his life. Her words were in the room with him. I want a child from you. They were not an echo. They were a presence. They sat in the empty chair opposite him. They lay in his cold, empty cot. They stared back at him from the dark square of the window. His mind, usually a quiet, orderly place, was a riot. He tried to think, to find the logic. Reason was his shield. He had used it to build his solitary life. Reason told him this was madness. She was Apache. He was a white settler, a man the government and the townsfolk considered the rightful owner of this patch of dust. To her people, he was an invader. To his people, she was a savage. A child between them would be an outcast, a target, a creature belonging to neither world. It was a death sentence. He thought of Ocotillo Bend. He pictured the faces in the general store, the hard, judging eyes of Sheriff Harlan Crook, the pious, thin-lipped whispers of the church women. He could already hear the words, half-breed, squawman. He would be less than a ghost then. He would be a pariah. That was reason. But the clock ticked, tick, 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 and his heart, a dull, aching thing he had long ignored, counted the empty spaces, the empty chair, the cold cot, the silence that was not peace, but a void. He was 24 years old, and he had not had a meaningful conversation with another human being in, he could not remember how long. Not since before the accident. The memory rose, as it always did in the dark. 2 years gone. His father, a man of loud belief and unyielding will, had been digging the well deeper. The dry season had been hard. His father had cursed the sky, cursed the land, and gone down into the earth with a shovel and a grim certainty. Eli, then 22, had been holding the rope. He remembered the smell of the damp earth, the hollow echo of the pickaxe, and then the other sound. A thump, a sliding, crumbling sound, and then his father's voice. Not a shout, but a sharp, surprised intake of air, and then silence. Not the silence of the cabin, but a thick, terrible, underground silence. He had pulled, he had screamed, he had pulled until his hands were raw and bleeding, when the men from Ocotillo Bend finally came, summoned by his frantic, smoke-signaled fire. It had taken them 6 hours to bring his father up. He was not his father. He was just a shape, broken by earth and stone, at the burial. What passed for a funeral. Eli had stood, mute, unable to cry. He just felt empty. He remembered Mr. Abernathy, the feed store owner, putting a heavy hand on his shoulder and saying, "Your PA was a strong man, a fighter." The implication was clear. Eli was not. The townsfolk had been kind. In their sharp-edged way. They called him quiet. They called him poor Eli Mercer. But he heard the word they did not say. Weak. He had known it was what his father thought. Too soft for this land, he would bellow, after Eli had hesitated to shoot a lame calf. You think too much and act too little. After the funeral, the emptiness had been a relief. The silence was a balm. He had retreated. He stopped going to market. He stopped going to church. He let the isolation grow up around him like a fortress wall. He had convinced himself it was peace. He had convinced himself it was enough. Until today. I want a child from you. The words did not sound like the town's judgment. They did not sound like his father's disappointment. They sounded like the strike of a hammer on an anvil. They were a statement of fact. They were a choice. She had chosen him. Eli looked down at his hands, spread on the rough wood of the table. They were not weak hands. They were broad, scarred, the knuckles swollen. The palms were a map of calluses, thick and yellowed. These were the hands of a man who repaired windmills, who dug irrigation ditches for his nopal, who set and mended his own fences. These were the hands of a survivor. But were they the hands of a man she saw? Were they enough? He did not sleep. When the first gray light touched the window, he was still sitting there. The lamp had burned dry. The clock was still ticking. He stood up. his joints cracking in the cold. His fear had a new name. It was not the fear of her. It was the fear of her return. He moved through the morning with a desperate, familiar rhythm. This was his armor, the routine. He went to the lean-to, the air sharp with the smell of horse and hay. His mare, a steady bay named Old Sue, nickered softly. He measured out her feed, his motions jerky, too fast. He stopped, forced himself to slow down. He stroked her neck, feeling the warmth of her hide, the solid, simple life of her. He fetched water from the well. The well. He hated it, but he made himself look down into the black, reflective circle. He lowered the bucket, listening to the rope scrape, the pulley groan. It was the sound that had haunted his dreams for 2 years. This morning, it just sounded like a machine. He patched the canvas on the barn roof, his fingers clumsy with the needle. He checked the water level in the cistern. He did everything he always did, a litany of chores meant to prove the world was the same as it had been yesterday. It was all a lie. He knew the exact moment she appeared. The light shifted. The air grew still. He was on the west side of the cabin, checking the mortar, and he felt it, the same weight as yesterday. He did not want to look. He told himself not to. He told himself to walk inside, to bolt the door, to wait until she was gone. He looked. She was on the Palo Verde Ridge, a half-mile to the north, a dark shape against the morning sky. Horse and rider one. She was not looking at him. She was looking at his homestead. He had spent the night preparing his refusals. He had a dozen of them, practiced and ready. I am a simple man. I mean you no harm, but I cannot. This is not my concern. Please, leave me in peace. They all turned to dust in his mouth. They were the words of a ghost. She began to ride toward him, not fast, but with that same inevitable pace. This time, Eli did not wait. He put his tools down. He wiped his palms on his trousers, and he started walking. He walked out from the shadow of his cabin, past his failed no-pal patch, and stood in the open, waiting. She rode up, stopping 20 feet away. She dismounted. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. He had meant to be polite. He had meant to be firm, but the words that came out were raw, torn from a place he did not know he had. Why me? It was not a question. It was a plea. Why me? Why break my silence? Why see me at all? Nasha Tenawi looked at him. Her face was as calm as it had been yesterday. She took a few steps closer, stopping at the edge of his tilled, dry ground. I have watched you, she said. Her voice was just as he remembered, soft and solid. For 5 days. Eli flinched. 5 days. He had been spied on, measured, and he had never even known. The thought of it, of her eyes on him as he moved through his solitary life, made him feel naked, exposed. You saw, he started, his voice cracking. A man fixing a fence. I saw, she said, cutting him off. A man leave water for the wild horses. He stared. He had done that. 3 days ago, a small band of mustangs, ribs showing, had haunted the edge of his property. He had filled a trough for them, a foolish, wasteful gesture his father would have scorned. I saw, she continued. A man who waited. You had brush to burn. The wind was high. You waited 2 days for it to die, so the fire would not run. He had done that, too, impatient, frustrated, but he had waited. And when you do your work, she said, her black eyes moving over him, you do not curse the land. You do not strike your animal. You move with it. The men of my people, they are taught to be a storm. They break what is in their path. The white men in your town, they are a disease. They poison what they touch. You, she paused, searching for the word. You are strong in a quiet way. You bend. You endure. You respect the ground. Eli had no answer. He had never heard such words. He had been called weak, shy, soft. He had never been called strong. Why? He whispered. The question different now. Why do you need this? Nasha's face, for the first time, changed. The resolve did not lessen. But a shadow passed through her eyes. A deep, ancient sorrow. "My people are diminishing," she said, her voice flat. "The soldiers moved us. The sickness came. The drought starves our children. We are fading. Our stories are being forgotten." She looked away from him then, toward the Cerro Blanco ridge, a place that was her home. "A child," she said, "must be born. A child who can walk in this new, white world, but who will carry the blood and the stories of the people. A child who can learn your ways, and also learn our traditions. A child who will honor the land, not just own it." She turned back to him, her gaze so intense it was a physical blow. "I do not ask for a knight," she said. "I do not ask for a husband. I ask for a life, a child that will be raised with both, with your quiet strength and with my people's memory." Eli finally understood. This was not desire. This was not a proposal. It was a treaty. It was a desperate act of survival. She was not asking for him to share his cot. She was asking for him to share his world. She was asking him to help her build a bridge. And he knew, deep in his bones, that the men on both sides would be waiting with guns and torches, ready to burn that bridge to the ground. They did not come alone the next day. Eli saw the dust first, a thick, angry plume rising from the base of the Cerro Blanco ridge. It moved fast, faster than Nasha's solitary approach had been. This was not a visit. It was a raid. He was at the well, the bucket halfway up. He let the rope slip, the wooden handle burning his palms as it spun. The splash at the bottom sounded like a gunshot in the sudden, tense silence. 3 riders. They broke from the dust cloud, their horses lathered and blowing hard. They did not stop at the ridge. They galloped straight for his cabin, straight for the patch of ground where he and Nasha had stood the day before. Eli's first instinct was to run. The cabin door was 10 feet away. His father's rifle was leaning just inside the frame. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He did not move. He stood by the well, his hands empty, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The riders pulled up sharply, their horses rearing, hooves churning the dry earth not 5 yards from him. The dust they kicked up coated Eli's skin, gritty and tasting of alkali. The leader was a woman. She was older, her hair a striking steel gray, pulled back severely from a face that looked like it had been carved from seasoned oak. Her eyes were hard, glittering with a fierce, protective anger. Flanking her were 2 men, both in their 40s, lean and scarred, their faces set in grim masks of hostility. They carried rifles across their saddles, not aimed, but ready. They did not speak to him. They looked through him. The older woman turned to the ridge behind them, where Nasha was just now appearing. She was riding the pinto, her pace unhurried, contrasting sharply with the violence of the other's arrival. As Nasha approached, the older woman began to speak. It was a torrent of words, sharp and guttural, the Apache language flowing like a flash flood, fast and dangerous. Eli did not understand a syllable, but he did not need to. The tone was unmistakable. It was accusation. It was disbelief. It was scorn. The 2 men added their voices, their words shorter, like barked commands. They gestured toward Eli, their hands chopping the air. He saw the sneer on their faces, the way their eyes flicked over his patched clothes, his meager homestead, his empty hands. They were listing his failings. He was sure of it. They were naming every weakness he had ever felt in himself. Nasha rode into the center of the storm. She did not raise her voice. She stopped her horse between Eli and the riders, placing herself physically in the line of fire. It was a small movement, a slight shift of her mount's hindquarters, but it was a shield. She spoke back to them. Her voice was the same low, steady tone she had used with him, but now it had an edge of steel. She did not argue. She stated, the older woman, Mawela. He would later learn snapped something at Nasha, her finger jabbing toward Eli. Then, she turned her fierce gaze directly on him. "You are weak," she said. The English words were sudden, shocking in their clarity. They were not a question. They were a verdict. Eli flinched. It was the word he feared most. It was the word his father had used. It was the word the town whispered. To hear it spoken aloud, by this formidable stranger, felt like a physical blow to the chest. When the hard season comes, Mawela continued, her voice dripping with certainty. You will run, you will break. You are soft wood. You will rot in the rain. Eli's throat tightened. Shame, hot and bitter, rose up in him. He wanted to deny it, to shout that he had survived 2 years alone, that he had kept this place going. But the words stuck, because a part of him believed her. A part of him had always believed he was just waiting to fail. Nasha did not let the silence stretch. Strength is not always a shout, she said, in English now, so Eli could understand. She looked at Mawela, her expression unyielding. The cactus does not fight the sun. It endures it. It holds its water while the oak tree dies of thirst. His quiet has kept him alive here. One of the men laughed. A harsh, barking sound. He said something in Apache, a clear insult, and made a gesture, a sweeping motion of his hand, dismissive, as if brushing away a troublesome fly. He urged his horse forward a step, the animal's massive shoulder brushing against Nasha's pinto, pushing toward Eli. It was a test, a threat. Nasha did not move her horse. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the man's. She said one word, just one. It was short, sharp, like the crack of a whip. The man stopped. His horse danced nervously, but he did not advance. He glared at her, his jaw working, but he pulled his mount back. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. It was a standoff, balanced on a razor's edge. Mawela looked from the man to Nasha, and finally back to Eli. Her assessment had not changed, but something else had entered her eyes. Not respect, not yet, but perhaps a flicker of calculation. Your choice, she said to Nasha, her voice cold, will be questioned. By the council, by everyone. Let them question, Nasha replied. Mawela gave a curt nod. She jerked her reins, turning her horse violently. The two men followed suit. They thundered off the way they had come, leaving only dust and the echo of their judgment behind. Silence slammed back into the homestead. It took a long time for the dust to settle. Eli stood there, rooted to the spot. His heart was still racing, but it was different now. It wasn't just fear, it was something else. Adrenaline, anger, and a strange, startling awareness of his own being. He was alive. He had stood there, unarmed, facing 3 hostile riders, and he hadn't run. He hadn't bolted for the cabin. He had just stood. He heard his own breath, loud and ragged in the quiet. In, out, in, out. It sounded loud. It sounded important. For the first time in 2 years, his own existence felt like something worth defending. He looked at Nasha. She was still sitting on her horse, watching the retreating riders. Her back was straight, but he thought he saw a slight tremor in her hands where they held the reins. She turned to him. The steel was gone from her voice, replaced by that same intense, measuring gravity. If your answer is no, she said, say it now, before they return. Eli looked at her. He saw the dust on her face, the fierce set of her jaw, the vulnerability she hid so well behind her resolve. He saw the woman who had just stood between him and her own people. And if it is yes, he asked. His voice was rough, unused. Nasha looked toward the horizon, where the dust cloud was fading against the Cerro Blanco. If it is yes, she said, bringing her gaze back to him. Then we must prepare. The storm is not coming. Eli Mercer, it is here. He did not answer immediately. The word yes was terrifying. It meant letting go of his safe, silent world. It meant walking into a fire he didn't know how to fight. But he didn't look away. He couldn't. Her eyes held him, anchored him to the earth more solidly than any fence post he had ever driven. He didn't say the word. Not yet. But he didn't step back. And in the quiet of the high desert morning, that was answer enough for now. The change did not come with the arrival of riders, but with a whisper carried on the wind. It was a word that drifted out from Ocotillo Bend, passing from the saloon to the general store, and finally carried by a prospector past Dust Creek Homestead. The word was railroad. It was a word of power, one that promised iron and smoke, and one that invariably demanded water. The rumor was that the Southern Pacific was sending surveyors, that they intended to sink a deep well, a permanent one, right in the middle of the Mesquite Wash. Where a railroad went, a new kind of man followed. A foreman named Vernon Pike had set up a camp near the wash, a collection of stained tents and rough-spoken men who wore their sidearms low and loose. They were not farmers or prospectors. They were gunmen, hired to clear the way, and their first priority was securing the water that the railroad would need. Eli heard the talk when he made a rare, necessary trip to the feed store. The men on the porch spoke in low, worried tones. Pike's men had already diverted a small creek, turning a pasture for 3 families into a dry, cracked flat. When the families had protested, they were met with drawn rifles. They had gone to Sheriff Harlan Crook, the sheriff, a man whose gut had grown large and soft on his office, listened patiently, his thumbs hooked in his pockets. He said it was a corporate matter, a dispute over unfiled claims. He promised to look into it. Eli watched Sheriff Crook later that day, laughing with Vernon Pike outside the saloon, taking a thick cigar from the foreman's silver-plated case. The sheriff's pockets, Eli noted, seemed heavier every week. The law in Ocotillo Bend had been bought and paid for. This was the world, Eli thought, a storm of greed and iron that men like him were meant to hide from. He bought his sacks of grain, his salt, and 2 new lengths of wire, and faded back into the desert, grateful for the isolation that kept him invisible. He was wrong. Nasha came 3 days later. She did not ride to his cabin. He saw her walking from the south, her pinto trailing behind her. She was walking from his land, not to it. She was carrying something. He met her by the lean-to. Her face was harder than he had ever seen it, a mask of cold, controlled fury. "They have marked the well," she said, no greeting, no preamble. "What well?" "Arroyo de Cobre, the well of our mothers." She held up the object in her hand. It was a wooden ladle, old and dark, the handle split. "It was a gift from my grandmother's grandmother. I left it there, as we always do, for travelers." They threw it on the ground. "Who did?" Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. "The railroad men. They have marked the stones. They have painted them red." She described it, her voice low and tight. The well at Arroyo de Cobre was not just a hole in the ground. It was a place of ceremony, a place where the women gathered. It was the heart of their small, tenacious community. "They say," Nasha said, her eyes fixed on the distant ridge, "they will fill it with rock to set a pillar, a support for a bridge that will carry their smoke wagons. But it is your water," Eli said, the words tasting stupid and small as soon as he said them. "The land, to them, is a map of straight lines. They do not see what is beneath. They do not care." She finally looked at him, and he saw the fear beneath her anger. "If we lose that well, the next one is a 3-day walk. The women, the children, they will spend their lives walking for water. The stories will stop. The ceremony of the first rain, it will die. A people cannot live without their ceremonies." Eli looked at this woman, who had come to him asking for a child to preserve these very traditions. He suddenly understood. This was not a rumor anymore. This was not a distant political fight. This was a war for survival, and it was being fought right here. At the source of all life in the desert, the water, he realized, with a chilling certainty, that the child, Nasha, spoke of their child, if such a thing could be, would be born into this. There was no hiding. There was no neutral ground. His fence line, which he had so carefully maintained, meant nothing. The railroad, and Pike, and the bought-off sheriff were drawing a new line, and he was already on the other side of it. Whether he liked it or not, he had not given her his answer. He had not said yes or no, but his body, his hands, seemed to make the choice for him. He turned, not saying a word, and walked to his small, dry storehouse. He unlatched the heavy wooden door. Inside, It smelled of dust and dried corn. He had 4 sacks of dried maize, his emergency store, the grain he had painstakingly grown and harvested 2 seasons ago. It was his insurance against the drought he knew would come. He hefted one of the sacks onto his shoulder, the 50-pound weight settling across his back. He carried it out into the sunlight, to where Nasha stood. He said nothing, just opened the sack. Her eyes widened, just slightly. The next day, 2 Apache women, older, their faces maps of hardship, walked along the edge of his property. They moved as ghosts, expecting to be shouted at, or worse. Eli was waiting. He had the sack of corn open and a smaller bag filled. He held it out. The women stopped, staring at him with a mixture of suspicion and disbelief. He did not speak. He just held out the bag. The younger of the 2 women, her eyes darted nervously, stepped forward and took it, her fingers brushing his. She said nothing, but nodded, a sharp, quick gesture of understanding. He did this 3 more times, as small groups, women and children, passed, their paths diverted by the gunmen at the wash. He was a silent, reliable presence at the edge of his land, offering what he had. His second act was simpler. Nasha had seen him give water to the wild horses. He had not done it since. It felt foolish. Now, it felt necessary. He took his father's old wooden trough, the one from the long-dead mule, and repaired it. He hauled it to the far eastern edge of his property, near the game trail, and filled it with water from his own well. It took him 4 trips. It was a hard, aching labor, and it left his cistern dangerously low. He did it anyway. He was refilling it 2 days later when they came. They were not the main group, just 2 of them, Pike's men. They rode up, their horses big, mean-looking geldings, their faces shadowed by the wide brims of their hats. They smelled of whiskey and old sweat. "Well, now, looked here, Jack," the first man said, his voice a lazy drawl. He had a scarred lip and yellow teeth. "We got us a farmer, a watering farmer." The second man, Jack, was younger, quieter, but his eyes were cold and empty. He just watched Eli, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "That's railroad water you're wasting, friend," Scarlip said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Eli's boot. "That well belongs to Mr. Pike now. This is my well," Eli said. His voice was a reedy whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, surprised at the tremor in it. "This is my land. Your land." The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. He swung down from his horse. He walked over to the trough, where 2 lizards were sunning themselves. "Your land is whatever, mister. Pike says it ain't. And this?" He kicked the trough. The wood, old and brittle, splintered. The water gushed out, forming a dark, spreading stain in the dust. "This is a waste." He kicked it again, harder, splintering the side. "Stop," Eli said. "Stop what you gonna do, farmer. You gonna talk me to death." The second man, Jack, unholstered his pistol. He didn't aim it at Eli. He aimed it at the remains of the trough and fired. The shot was deafening. Wood chips flew into the air. "This is private property," Eli said, his heart hammering so hard he felt sick. He was shaking, a visible tremor in his hands and knees. "I want you to leave. Get off my land." Scarlip turned to him, his eyes narrowing. He seemed amused. "You want us to... what?" "Get off," Eli said, his voice stronger this time, though it was high with terror. "Now!" The man's amusement vanished. "You're a feisty one. Ain't you mouthy, Mr. Pike? He don't like mouthy farmers." He stepped close, invading Eli's space. Eli stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run. "You're gonna learn to keep that mouth shut," the man whispered. The punch was fast. Eli barely saw it. It was a hard, brutal blow to the side of his mouth. His head snapped back, and he tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The world went gray for a second, and he staggered, but he did not fall. He just stood there, his hand raised to his split lip, blood welling, his ears ringing. He did not fight back. He did not curse. He just looked the man in the eye, his gaze unwavering, even as his body trembled in shock. The man, Scarlip, looked confused. He had expected Eli to fall, or to run, or to beg. He had not expected this quiet, this standing. "You're crazy, old man," he muttered, but his certainty was gone. "He ain't crazy," a voice said. "Nasha." She was there, on her pinto, 10 yards away. She must have come from the rocks. She held no weapon. Her hands were resting on her thighs, but her presence was electric. The two men tensed. Jack's pistol came up, this time pointing at her. "Easy, Injun girl," Scarlip said, putting a hand out. "This ain't your concern. You are on his land," Nasha said, her voice cutting through the air, cold and sharp as obsidian. "You have destroyed his property. You have struck him. This is noted." Noted," Scarlip laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "What are you gonna do? Girl, you and your farmer boy, you gonna file a report with the sheriff?" "No," Nasha said. She looked at Scarlip, then at Jack, then back at Scarlip. She was memorizing them. "You use your laws, the laws of paper and bought men, but you will pay for this. By those same laws, I will see it." There was no threat of violence in her voice. There was something colder. There was a promise. Scarlip held her gaze for a long, stretched-out second. Then he spat in the dirt again. "Waste of time," he said, too loudly. "Come on, Jack." He swung back onto his horse. Jack holstered his pistol, his eyes never leaving Nasha. "This ain't over, farmer," Scarlip shouted, as they rode away. Not by a long shot. Eli stood there, tasting his own blood, watching them go. Nasha dismounted and walked to him. She didn't fuss over him. She didn't touch his bleeding lip. She just looked at the broken, splintered trough and the dark patch of mud where the water had been. "You are bleeding," she said. "I know," Eli rasped. "You did not run." "No." She pulled him back, her hand finally, briefly, touching his elbow. A light, guiding pressure. "Come, the sun is high." That evening, Eli sat on his porch. His lip was swollen, a deep purple, and it throbbed with a dull ache. He tasted blood every time he swallowed. He watched the sun set, painting the sky in violent shades of red and orange. The wind had picked up, as it always did at dusk. The windmill, the one he had repaired 100 times, was turning. It made a steady, rhythmic sound. Click-clack, click-clack. It was the sound of his mother's clock, writ large against the sky. It was the sound of his quiet, solitary life. But tonight, it sounded different. It was not a comforting sound. It was restless. It was the sound of a gear turning, of a machine starting up. It was a warning. The wind had changed, and he, Eli Mercer, had finally, foolishly, changed with it. The season turned not with a drop in temperature, but with a darkening of the southern sky. The clouds, heavy and bruised with rain, piled up over the distant mountains, swallowing the sun long before it hit the horizon. The air grew thick, electric, smelling of ozone and wet dust. Nasha, who had spent the last 3 days helping Eli reinforce his western fence line, stopped her work. She looked at the sky, her eyes narrowing. "The wash will run tonight," she said. It was not a guess. Eli looked up. The clouds were massive, terrifyingly beautiful. "The first rain. A flash flood," she corrected. "The ground is too hard. It will not drink. It will run." Eli's stomach tightened. His barn roof. The shingles on the north side had been loose for weeks, rattling like dry bones in the wind. He had been putting it off. He hated heights. It was a paralyzing, irrational fear that turned his legs to water and his hands to clumsy, shaking things. He looked at the barn. It was not high, perhaps 15 feet at the peak, but to him, it might as well have been a cliff face. "The roof," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "If the wind catches those loose boards, then you will lose your feed." Nasha finished. She walked to the lean-to where he kept his tools. She came back with his heavy wooden ladder and a sack of nails. She set them down at his feet. She did not offer to do it for him. She knew his fear. He had seen her watching him when he had to climb the windmill tower a week ago. Seen the way his knuckles had turned white on the rungs. "I will hold it," she said, placing her hands on the ladder's rails, planting her feet wide. Eli looked at the ladder, then at the darkening sky. The wind was already picking up, whipping dust into small, stinging devils around their boots. "I can't," he whispered. The shame was acute, burning his neck. "You can," she said. Her voice was not gentle. It was firm, unyielding. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Eli. It is acting in spite of it. Climb!" He swallowed hard. He picked up the hammer, shoved a handful of nails into his pocket, and put his boot on the first rung. It was terrifying. Every step up was a battle against his own instincts. The wind snatched at his hat, tried to push him off balance. The ladder creaked, but it held steady. Nasha was there, an anchor at the bottom. He reached the roof. The wind was worse up here. It tore at his clothes, howled in his ears. He crawled to the loose section, his body flat against the pitching, his heart hammering against the tin. He began to work. It was brutal, clumsy labor. The wind tried to rip the new shingles from his hands before he could set them. He hammered his own thumb, a sharp, sickening crunch that made him cry out. Blood welled up under the nail, throbbing in time with his racing heart. He wanted to quit. He wanted to slide down, to hide in the cabin. He looked down. Nasha was looking up at him. She did not shout encouragement. She just watched, her face calm, her hands steady on the ladder. He turned back to the work. He drove another nail, then another. The pain in his thumb became a dull, distant thing, drowned out by the sheer necessity of the task. By the time he was done, the first fat, heavy drops of rain were hitting the dust, kicking up little puffs of steam. He scrambled down the ladder, his legs shaking so hard he could barely stand when he hit the ground. He looked at Nasha. He was panting, covered in sweat and dust, his hand throbbing. "It is done," he gasped. "Good," she said. She didn't smile, but her eyes were warm. "Now, the horses." The real storm hit an hour later. It was a wall of water, a roaring, chaotic deluge that turned the world into a gray, blurred nightmare. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a physical blow that rattled Eli's teeth. And then the sound changed. Beneath the roar of the rain, there was another sound, a deeper, grinding noise, like the earth itself was tearing apart. "The wash!" Nasha shouted over the din. They ran to the edge of the ridge that overlooked the Mesquite Wash. It was a terrifying sight. A wall of brown water, 10 feet high, was churning down the dry riverbed. It carried uprooted mesquite trees, dead cactus, and tumbling helplessly in the churning mud were 4 young calves. They must have strayed from the herd up north, caught in the low ground when the water hit. They were being swept toward the narrows, where the rocks would grind them to pieces. Eli didn't think. He didn't weigh the risks. He just moved. "Get the ropes," he yelled, already running for the lean-to. They saddled the horses in seconds, their hands flying over wet leather. They rode out into the storm, the rain stinging their faces like buckshot. They reached the bank of the wash just ahead of the flood's crest. The roar was deafening. The ground shook under their horses' hooves. "We have to snag them before the narrows," Eli shouted, pointing downstream. They split up. Nasha took the high bank, Eli the lower, closer to the churning water. He uncoiled his lariat, the stiff hemp rope heavy and slick with rain. The first calf swept past, a bawling, terrified brown head bobbing in the muck. Eli threw. The loop landed true, settling over the calf's neck. "Pull! Sue, pull!" he screamed, wrapping the rope around his saddle horn. His mare, old Sue, dug her hooves into the slick mud, straining backward. The rope went taut, vibrating like a plucked string. Slowly, agonizingly, they dragged the calf out of the current, up the slippery bank. until it collapsed, shivering and muddy. On solid ground, one saved. Nasha had snagged another further down. He saw her pony straining, saw her lean body working in perfect rhythm with the horse, her face a mask of fierce concentration. 2 more calves were coming fast. Eli rode deeper into the mud, closer to the edge. He threw again, missed. The wind took the loop. He recoiled frantically, his hands numb with cold. He threw again, got it. He dallied the rope, but this time, the mud under old Sue's hooves gave way. The mare screamed as she slid sideways, toward the raging brown water. Eli felt the sickening lurch of gravity taking over. He was going in. "Eli!" Nasha's voice cut through the roar. He looked up. She was there, on the solid bank above him. She had thrown her own rope, not at a calf, but at his saddle horn. It had caught. "Look at me!" she screamed. Her horse braced, straining against his weight. "Do not look at the water. Look at me." He locked his eyes on hers, in that chaotic, terrifying world of mud and noise. Her dark eyes were the only solid thing. He focused on them, on the fierce, unwavering command in them. He urged old Sue forward, fighting the slide, using Nasha's rope as a lifeline. Inch by agonizing inch, they clawed their way back up the bank. When they hit solid ground, he almost fell out of the saddle. He was shaking uncontrollably. They saved all 4 calves. They herded the shivering animals into his barn, now dry thanks to his newly repaired roof. The storm was beginning to ease, the torrential downpour softening to a steady, soaking rain. Inside the barn, it was warm, smelling of wet hide and fresh hay. They stood there, dripping, exhausted, their chests heaving. Eli looked at the calves, safe and dry. He looked at the roof that hadn't leaked, and then he looked at Nasha. A strange sound bubbled up in his throat. It was a laugh, a rusty, cracking sound that he barely recognized as his own. He laughed again, louder this time, a breathless, incredulous sound of pure relief. He hadn't laughed in 2 years. Nasha watched him. She didn't laugh, but the corners of her mouth twitched upward. She stepped closer to him. She took his hand, the one he had smashed with the hammer. The thumb was swollen, the nail turning an angry purple-black. "You are hurt?" she said softly. "It's nothing," he said, but he didn't pull away. She led him to the tack bench. She found a small tin of salve he used for saddle sores, but she didn't use it. Instead, she reached into her pouch and pulled out a small bundle of dried leaves and a sticky, amber-colored resin. "Ocotillo gum," she explained, warming the resin in her hands until it was pliable. "It draws out the pain. It speeds the healing." She worked with gentle, efficient movements. She spread the warm resin over his throbbing thumb, then wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean cloth she tore from the hem of her own wet skirt. Her touch was not hesitant. It was practical, skilled, but undeniably intimate. He watched her dark head bent over his hand, felt the warmth of her fingers on his skin. It was the most tender thing anyone had done for him since his mother died. When she was finished, she didn't immediately let go of his hand. She looked up at him. "You did well today, Eli Mercer," she said. "You climbed. You rode. You stood. I was terrified," he admitted. The truth, easy to say now. "Yes," she said. "That is what made it brave." They went outside to the small porch of the cabin. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. The air was cool and sweet, smelling of wet sagebrush and damp earth. The sound of the wash was already quieting, a distant murmur now instead of a roar. They sat on the single bench, their shoulders touching. They didn't speak. They just listened to the last drops of water falling from the eaves. A steady, peaceful rhythm. Eli felt a profound, unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. He was exhausted, battered, his hand throbbed, and he was covered in mud, but he felt whole. He felt capable. He looked at Nasha out of the corner of his eye. She was looking out at the desert, her profile softened by the fading light. She belonged here, on this porch, beside him. The thought was no longer terrifying. It was just right. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. It was full of shared danger. shared effort, and a growing, unspoken understanding. It was, Eli thought as he watched the first stars emerge in the cleared sky, the best silence he had ever known. The cabin was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the hollow, ringing silence of Eli's isolation. It was a shared quiet, filled with the sound of the rain's last drips from the eaves and the steady, soft crackle of the fire he had built in the hearth. They had eaten a simple meal of cornbread and beans, their first since the flood. They were still damp, their clothes steaming in the heat of the fire, but the chill was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary warmth. The shadows their forms cast on the rough log walls were large, and they moved together, dancing as one. Nasha sat on the small rug before the fire, her knees drawn up. She was staring into the flames, her face softened by the yellow light. Eli sat in his father's chair, a few feet away, watching her. He was still holding the cloth-wrapped bundle of his throbbing hand. "My grandmother," Nasha said, her voice so low he almost thought it was the fire speaking. "She taught me to listen." Eli said nothing, just tilted his head, inviting the rest, "Not to people." Nasha continued, a small, rare smile touching her lips. "People," she said, "use words to hide. She taught me to listen to the earth, to the way the wind speaks before it brings the rain, to the sound a stone makes when it is ready to be moved, to the silence of a growing thing." She picked up a small twig from the kindling box and poked at the embers, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. She used to say that the loudest tree in the forest is the first to fall in a storm, because it is all noise and no root. But the small plants, the ones that live in the cracks of the rock, they hold on, they bend, they keep their water. They know how to be quiet. She said that was the greatest strength. She turned her head, her dark eyes finding his in the firelight. "She would have understood you. Eli Mercer." Eli's breath caught. He looked down at his own calloused hands, at the bandaged, throbbing one she had cared for. All his life, he had seen his own quiet as a flaw, a weakness to be hidden, a failure that had disappointed his father and made him invisible to the world. A log in the fire cracked, a sharp retort that made him jump. "I am not a brave man, Nasha," he whispered. The words came out, rough and raw, pulled from a place he kept locked. "Today, on the roof, by the wash." That was not bravery. That was, I do not know what it was. He looked up from his hands, meeting her steady gaze. The confession was on his lips, a heavy, bitter stone he had carried for years. "What I am," he said, his voice thick, "is a coward. My whole life, I have been so afraid of failing that I have never truly begun." He said it. He had finally said it aloud. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than the well, heavier than the floodwater. He expected her to look away, to see the judgment he had always seen in his father's eyes. Nasha did not look away. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, she rose from the rug and came to him. She did not sit. She knelt on the floor in front of his chair, bringing her eyes level with his. She was so close he could smell the rain on her skin and the faint, clean scent of the sage she carried in her pouch. "Let me see your hands," she said, her voice soft. It was the same tone she had used on the porch, a request, not a command. His hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from the simple, terrifying power of this proximity, this attention. He uncurled his fingers and held them out, palms up, the smashed, bandaged one, and the healthy one. She reached out and laid her own hand on top of his good one. Her hand was smaller than his, slender, but just as calloused. Her skin was warm. She did not speak. She simply traced the lines on his palm with her finger. She followed the thick, raised calluses at the base of his fingers, the ones he got from the axe handle. She touched the silvery, puckered scar on his wrist, from when he had slipped with a skinning knife 3 years ago. It felt less like a touch and more like a reading, as if she was deciphering the story of his life, a story he had never known how to tell. "These are not the hands of a man who has never begun," she said. her voice firm. "These are the hands of a man who has survived, who has built, who has held on, alone, when others would have been broken." She looked up, her face inches from his. Her dark eyes were pools of the firelight. "You are not afraid of failure, Eli. You are afraid of loss. You are afraid to build something you cannot bear to see broken." He had no defense against her words. She saw him. She saw the truth he had hidden even from himself. He could not speak. He could only look at her. He saw the strength that had faced down her own people, that had ridden into a storm. He saw the sorrow of a people fading. He saw the woman who had come to him with an impossible request, a woman who saw in his silence not a weakness, but a strength that bends. Their breathing slowed, and it was the only sound in the room, a soft, shared rhythm. There was no turning away. The consent was in the stillness, in the unblinking gaze, in the shared air. He leaned forward, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. She met him halfway. The embrace was slow, hesitant at first, then sure. It was not a collision of passion, but a careful, intentional coming together. He rested his forehead against hers. Her hair was damp and smelled of the storm. He could feel the pulse in her temple, a steady beat that matched his own. He moved his hand, the good one, from her shoulder to her face, his thumb grazing the high line of her cheekbone. She closed her eyes at the touch. He felt her breath on his lips before they met. The kiss was gentle, almost tentative. It was a question, an exploration. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke. Then, she answered. She leaned into him, her lips softening, becoming sure. It was not a kiss of fire. It was a kiss of earth, of solid ground, of belonging. It was a promise, sealed without words. His heavy, damp jacket slid from his shoulders, forgotten, falling to the floor like a dried leaf. Her hands, which had been resting on his shoulders, moved. Her fingers were unhurried, tracing the line of his jaw, the column of his throat. Each touch was a question. His hand on her back, drawing her fractionally closer, was the answer. The light from the fire played over them, over the cabin walls where their shadows had merged completely. The camera of the world pulled back, leaving the small, steamy window as the only witness. Inside the cabin, there was no sound but the quiet murmur of voices, the soft shift of bodies, the steady, reliable beat of two hearts that had found the same rhythm. The fire in the hearth burned low, the bright, crackling logs collapsing into a bed of deep, glowing embers. The heat remained, a steady, radiating warmth that filled the small, silent room. The night was not about a physical act, but about the sealing of a vow. It was the careful, respectful, and complete lowering of all the fences they had built. It was an agreement, made in the quiet language of touch and breath, to build something new, together. When the first thin, gray light of dawn crept through the single window, it found them not in the cot, but on the rug before the cold hearth, wrapped in his father's thickest blanket. Eli stirred first. He opened his eyes to a world that was new. He was looking at the side of Nasha's face, her black hair fanned out over the rough wool. She was asleep, her expression peaceful, the iron-willed resolve she wore like armor all gone. In sleep, she looked younger, vulnerable. He watched her breathe. He felt a wave of protectiveness so fierce it almost frightened him, as if she felt his gaze. She opened her eyes. They were dark and clear, without a trace of sleep. They locked with his. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. There was an awkwardness, a shyness in the new light. A slow smile touched Eli's lips, a small, crooked, uncertain thing. Nasha watched it, and then a tiny, almost imperceptible smile of her own answered it. They did not speak. They did not need to. The world of yesterday was gone. The man who had been I and the woman who had been you were gone. In the quiet, gray light of the Arizona morning, their eyes were already calling each other by a new name. The summons came at dusk, carried by a young boy who appeared at the edge of Eli's property. spoke a few quick words to Nasha, and vanished back into the twilight. Mawela calls a circle, Nasha said. She was already moving, gathering her things. At Arroyo de Cobre. Now! A circle, Eli asked, his stomach tightening. A circle of questions, she said, her face grim. She will not let this rest. You must come. You must answer. He felt the old fear rise, the familiar urge to bolt the door and hide. This was her world, her laws. He would be an outsider, judged by rules he did not understand. Nasha saw the hesitation. She put her hand on his arm, her grip firm. You stood in the flood. You stood against the gunmen. Do not let their words be the thing that makes you run. He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, and nodded. He put on his jacket, the one that was still stiff from its soaking, and they rode out together. Arroyo de Cobre, the well of her mother's, was a place of quiet power. It was a cleft in the rock, hidden by a stand of old cottonwoods that had found a deep, secret water source. A small fire burned in a cleared, sandy patch, the flames licking at the darkness, reflecting in the small, still pool of the spring. They were already there. Mawela, the steel-haired elder, sat on a flat rock, her back straight, her presence dominating the circle. The two men who had first confronted Eli were there, standing in the shadows, their arms crossed. And there was a younger man, one Eli had not seen before. He was tall and lean, with a stillness that matched Nasha's. He was sharp, not in the ragged way of Pike's men, but in the way of a well-honed obsidian blade. His eyes were intelligent, and they watched Eli's approach with a calm, assessing neutrality. This, Eli sensed immediately, was a far more dangerous man than the other two combined. Chayton Greyhawk, Nasha murmured to Eli, her voice so low it was almost a breath. The one they had planned for me. The circle was small, perhaps a dozen people, mostly women. They all turned as Nasha and Eli walked into the firelight. Nasha did not go to the women. She stood beside Eli, a clear, silent declaration. Mawela let the silence stretch, her gaze fixed on Eli. You have come, she said, her voice flat. You have entered her world. If you have chosen, you must now step into the circle of questions. Eli looked at Nasha, who gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped forward, into the full, flickering light of the fire. He felt naked, his white man's clothes, his healing, split lip, his fear, all of it exposed for them to see. Before Mawela could speak, the young man, Chayton, stepped forward. He did not look at Eli. He looked at Nasha, and his voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly soft. But it carried in the quiet. I do not challenge this, Nasha, he said, speaking in English. For Eli, I challenge your choice. He turned to the circle, his gaze moving over the women. We all know the stories. We know of the women who were obedient, who did as the council said, who married for the good of the clan. He paused, and his eyes found a darkness in the fire. My own mother, he said, his voice tightening, was such a woman. She was obedient. She married a man she did not choose, a strong man, and he broke her. She lived for 20 years as a shadow, a dutiful, empty shell. She died staring at a wall. He looked back at Nasha, his expression fierce. I will not be the man who repeats that story. You have the right to choose, Nasha Tanawi, to choose who you build a life with. I will not stand in your way. He then turned, for the first time, and fixed Eli with his sharp, intelligent gaze. But I look at this man, Chayton said, his voice hardening, and I do not understand the choice. I see a farmer, a white man, a man who hides from his own kind. How will this man's spirit protect you? When he cannot even protect his own, he stepped back, his challenge delivered. It was not a challenge of fists, but of character. It was 1,000 times harder to answer. Mawela raised her hand. Chayton speaks of the spirit. That is the core of the matter. The child, so, white man, you will answer. She leaned forward, her eyes like black stones. The first question, she said. Where does water come from? Eli's mouth was dry. He looked at the spring, at the fire. He thought of Pike, of the railroad, of his own dry nopal patch. He thought of the trough he had filled, and the blood he had tasted. Water, Eli said, his voice rough, does not come from a place. It is a thing that is kept. It is the work of yesterday. It is the rain that was saved, the well that was dug, the spring that was not poisoned. It comes from remembering to care for it, so it will be there tomorrow. Mawela's expression did not change. She held the silence for a beat. The second question, the hungry season comes. The drought is long. Your own storehouse is low. What do you do? Eli thought of the corn, the 4 sacks he had kept, his insurance against the world, the sacks that were now half empty, given to the women and children he did not know. You find a way, he said, the words coming slowly, as he found the truth of them himself. You measure out what you have, and then you share. Because a full belly in a house of starving neighbors isn't a blessing. It is. It is a curse, waiting to happen. It is an invitation for violence. It's better to be hungry together than to be full and alone. A few of the women murmured, a low, shifting sound. Chayton watched him, his head tilted, his expression still unreadable. Mawela nodded, slowly. The third question, she said. You say you love this woman. You would have a child with her. What does it mean? To protect. Eli looked at Nasha. He saw her standing between him and her own people. That first day, he saw her pulling him from the mud of the wash. He saw her hand on the ladder. He thought of his father, a man who protected his family with a loud voice and a hard hand. A man who had died in the earth he was trying to conquer. To protect, Eli said, his voice gaining a strength he did not know it had. It is not just fighting. Anyone can fight. To protect is to stand in the way. It is to keep the spirit of the one you love from being broken. It is to hold the ladder. It is to pull them from the flood. It is to make sure they are not alone when they are afraid. Even if, he finished, his voice dropping, even if the one who is afraid is you. The circle was utterly still. Eli had spoken his deepest, most guarded truths. A young woman, one he had given corn to, spoke up from the shadows. Her voice was sharp with a practical fear. But the child? What of the child? It will be half. What language will it speak? Nasha, who had been silent, stepped forward. She placed her hand flat on her own heart. It will speak both, she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce pride. It will learn his words of planting and our words of the stars. It will walk between the 2 shores, and it will be the bridge. It will not be half, it will be whole. The firelight seemed to grow warmer. Mawela looked at Chayton, who gave a single, slow nod, a sign of something, of acceptance, perhaps. Mawela turned back to Eli, and her face had softened, just a fraction. It was not a smile, but the hard, oak-like anger was gone. You have answered, she said. You have spoken, not as a warrior, but not as a coward either. The circle will... She was cut off. A man burst into the clearing, running, stumbling. He was one of the Apache, a man Eli did not know, and his chest was heaving, his face a mask of terror and rage. They are there, he gasped, in broken English. For Eli's sake. At the well, Pike's men. The entire circle was on its feet. They have the boxes, the man cried, grabbing Chayton's arm. The dynamite. They have wires, they say. They say at sunrise, they will blast the rock to test for the deep water. They will collapse the spring. They will kill our mother. A wail went up from one of the women. The news landed like a physical blow. The ritual, the questions, the quiet analysis, it was all gone, blown away by the brutal reality of the world. Pike was not waiting. He was going to destroy their well, their heart. Chayton Greyhawk's face was transformed. The calm, intelligent man was gone. replaced by a cold, deadly warrior. He was already checking his rifle, his movements economical and precise. He looked at the other two men. "Get the horses. We ride." Then he looked at Eli. The contempt was gone from his eyes, replaced by a new, sharp, practical assessment. "This is not a question. Farmer," Chayton said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is not a story of your spirit. This is a fight, in the dark, against men with guns. This is where your protection meets the earth." He shouldered his rifle. "If you stand with us tonight, if you put your body between Nasha's water and the men who would destroy it, then I will be the first to change my word. I will be the first to call you brother." He held Eli's gaze. "But if you run to your cabin, you will live, but you will lose her, and you will prove you are exactly what I thought you were." Eli looked at the dynamite in his mind. He looked at the water in the spring. He looked at Nasha, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. He turned to Chayton. "I will not run," Eli said, his voice shaking, but clear. "But I will not be a part of a massacre. Show me how to stop this. Show me how to do this, without breaking the earth." Chayton stared at him for a long, hard second. Then, a flicker of something new respect entered his eyes. "Then come," he said, "and learn to move in the dark." The night was a black, breathless void. The moon had set, leaving the high desert in an inky darkness that magnified every sound. A dry twig snapping underfoot sounded like a pistol shot. The rustle of a lizard in the brush was a roar. They lay on their bellies on the rocky ridge overlooking the Arroyo de Cobre. Below them, the well was a pale, ghostly circle in the gloom. 3 lanterns hung from mesquite branches, casting pools of harsh, yellow light. Vernon Pike's men were there, 4 of them. They moved with a hurried, clumsy urgency, their shadows long and distorted. They were setting the charges. Eli, lying between Nasha and Chayton, felt his heart hammering against the cold stone. He could see the wooden crates, stenciled with red warnings. He could see the thick, waxed wires snaking across the sand, leading to a plunger box set safely back from the rim. 4 charges, Chayton whispered, his voice barely audible over the chirping of the crickets. 1 deep in the cleft, 3 around the rim. If they blow it, the whole face will collapse. The spring will be buried under ton of rock. "We have to cut the wires," Nasha murmured, her eyes locked on the scene below. "Too risky." Chayton said, "They'll see us. We need a diversion. Something loud. Something away from the well." He outlined the plan quickly, his words clipped and precise. He would take the 2 other Apache men and circle to the north. They would drive a small herd of wild mules through the brush, tying old cowbells to their halters. The noise would draw the guards away. That would leave the well unguarded for perhaps 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Chayton said, looking at Eli. "To get down there. Pull the caps and get out. Can you do it, farmer?" Eli looked at the wires. He looked at the men with their rifles leaning against the rocks. His hands were shaking. He was terrified. But then he looked at Nasha. In the starlight, her face was a mask of grim determination. This was her mother's well. This was her life. "I can do it," Eli whispered. The lie tasted like copper in his mouth, but he swallowed it. Chayton nodded, once, sharply. He melted into the darkness, silent as smoke. Nasha and Eli waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The tension was a physical weight, pressing them into the rock. Then, from the north, chaos erupted. A discordant jangle of bells, the braying of startled mules, and the sound of crashing brush shattered the night. "What in tarnation?" one of the guards yelled. "Coyotes spooking the stock," another shouted. "Go check it out, don't let me scatter." 3 of the men grabbed their rifles and ran toward the noise, their lantern light bobbing away into the dark. Only one remained, a hulking man standing near the plunger box, peering nervously into the gloom. "Now," Nasha hissed. They slid down the ridge, moving fast and low, using the shadows of the boulders for cover. They reached the bottom of the arroyo. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and the sulphurous tang of the dynamite. They reached the first charge. It was a bundle of red sticks wedged into a crack in the rock. A copper blasting cap was inserted into the top of one stick, with wires trailing away. "Don't pull the wires," Eli whispered, his voice shaking. "You might spark it. We have to pull the cap." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his small pair of wire cutters, the ones he used for fine fence work. His hands were slick with sweat. He took a breath, held it, and reached for the cap. It was wedged tight. He had to wiggle it, gently, so gently. A bead of sweat dripped from his nose. Landing on his own hand, he flinched, but didn't let go. With a soft pop, the cap slid free. He laid it gently on the sand. One down. They moved to the second. Same thing. Wiggle, pull, pop. Two down. They were at the third charge, the one deep in the cleft. When it happened, a rock clattered down the slope behind them. The guard at the plunger box spun around. "Who's there?" He raised his lantern. The light swung wildly, catching them. "Hey!" he shouted. "We got trouble!" He raised his rifle and fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space of the arroyo. The bullet struck the rock inches from Eli's head, sending a spray of sharp stone fragments into his face. He threw himself over the dynamite, shielding it with his body. It was an instinct, pure and simple. If another bullet hit that bundle... "Eli," Nasha screamed. She grabbed his collar and yanked him backward, pulling him away from the charge and into a shallow depression behind a large boulder. They tumbled together into the mud and damp sand. A tangle of limbs and desperate, panting breaths. The guard fired again, the bullet whining off the rock above them. Then, silence. No, not silence. A dull thud, like a sack of grain hitting the earth. They peered over the boulder. The guard was on the ground. Chayton was standing over him, slipping a leather thong around his wrists. He had come out of the darkness like a ghost and struck the man down with the butt of his rifle. "He is alive," Chayton said, his voice calm. "We do not spill blood on the water." They scrambled up. The other three guards were running back, their shouts echoing down the canyon. "The last charge!" Nasha yelled, pointing to the rim. It was too late. Vernon Pike himself had appeared on the ridge above them. He was holding a burning torch in one hand. "Get away from there!" Pike roared, his face twisted with fury. "I'll blow you all to kingdom come." He stood over the last bundle of dynamite, the one they hadn't reached. The fuse was short, maybe 6 inches. "You're trespassing on railroad property," Pike shouted, waving the torch. "It's not railroad property," Nasha shouted back, stepping out from behind the boulder. "It is now," Pike yelled. He lowered the torch toward the fuse. "Wait," Eli stepped out. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he had to stop that torch. He walked toward Pike, his hands raised, palms open. He forced himself to walk slowly, calmly, though his heart was trying to beat its way out of his chest. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Pike, you don't want to do this." Pike hesitated, the torch hovering inches from the fuse. "Who are you? You're that dirt farmer, ain't you?" "I am," Eli said, keeping his eyes on Pike's, ignoring the torch. "And I know you're a businessman. Mr. Pike, a man who follows the rules." "I make the rules out here," Pike snarled. "Not these rules," Eli said, taking another step. "Do you need a federal water permit to blast a recognized spring? Did you file one in Tucson?" It was a desperate gamble. He didn't know if such a permit even existed. He had read it once in an old territorial gazette, something about water rights on public land. Pike blinked. The question threw him. It was bureaucratic, boring, and completely unexpected in the middle of a standoff. "A what I don't need no stinking permit." "You do," Eli said, his voice gaining confidence. "If you blast this spring without it, the railroad will be liable for federal damages. Thousands of dollars. Mr. Pike, they'll take it out of your pay. They might even fire you for negligence." For a split second, Pike's greed battled with his anger. The torch wavered. That split second was all Nasha needed. She moved. She didn't run. She launched herself. She scrambled up the rocky slope like a mountain cat, covering the 10 feet between them in a blur of motion. Before Pike could react, she grabbed his wrist. The one holding the torch. She didn't try to wrestle it from him. She just yanked it down, hard, plunging the burning head into a deep, muddy pool of rainwater that had collected in a hollow of the rock. With a loud hiss, the torch went out. Pike roared and shoved her back. She stumbled, but kept her footing. "You little savage!" he screamed, reaching for his pistol. "That's enough. Vernon!" The new voice came from the entrance of the arroyo. It was calm, authoritative, and utterly unexpected. Sheriff Harlan Crook rode into the lantern light, looking unhappy to be out so late, but he wasn't alone. Riding beside him was a small, bespectacled man in a dusty city suit, looking terrified, and behind them, walking in a silent, formidable line, were Mahuela and 20 women of the Apache clan. Mahuela held a piece of wood in her hand. It was flat, polished, and covered in dense, carefully burned marks. "What is this?" Harlan, Pike demanded, his hand still on his gun. "These Indians are interfering with railroad business." "Actually, Mr. Pike," Chayton said, stepping forward from the shadows. "We are enforcing the law." He gestured to the small man on the horse. "This is Mr. Silas Reed, the clerk from the county seat. We persuaded him to join us tonight." Reed adjusted his glasses nervously. "Yes, well, I have examined the records." Mahuela stepped forward, holding up the wooden board. "This," Chayton said, his voice ringing with triumph, "is a copy of the original treaty signed by the territorial governor 20 years ago. It grants the Apache people perpetual, exclusive rights to the Arroyo de Cobre Spring. It is recognized by the federal government." He looked at Silas Reed. "Isn't that right, Mr. Clerk?" Reed squeaked. It appears to be so." "Yes, the seal is authentic." Pike stared at them, his face turning a mottled purple. "This is a trick, Harlan. Do something." Sheriff Crook sighed heavily. He looked at Pike, then at the 20 silent Apache women, then at Chayton and his rifle, and finally at Eli. "Looks like their paperwork is in order, Vernon," Crook said, his voice flat. He clearly didn't like it, but he liked being in the middle of a federal dispute even less. "You can't blast here, not without a court order from Tucson overturning that treaty. And that'll take months." Pike looked like he was going to explode. He glared at Eli, at Nasha, at Chayton. He had been beaten, not by guns, but by the one thing he couldn't just shoot: the law. "This isn't over," he spat, holstering his gun. "The railroad will get this water, mark my words." "Maybe," Eli said quietly, "but not tonight." Pike signaled to his men. They gathered their tools, sullen and angry, and retreated up the arroyo, their lantern light fading back toward their camp. Sheriff Crook and the clerk followed them, leaving the arroyo to silence once more. The danger was past. The spring was safe. As the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, the crickets began to chirp again. Mahuela walked over to where Eli stood. She looked him up and down, seeing the dust on his clothes, the cut on his cheek from the rock fragments, the exhaustion in his posture. She did not smile, but she placed a hand on his shoulder, a heavy, solid weight. "A man who is afraid," she said, her voice low and resonant in the dawn quiet, "stood in the fire for our water. He did not run. He spoke the words of law when guns were raised." She looked at Nasha, then back at Eli. "He is welcome at the fire." They rode back to Dust Creek as the sun cleared the ridge, painting the sky in soft, forgiving shades of peach and gold. The world felt scoured clean, not just by the rain, but by the night's events. They were exhausted, their bodies aching, their hands still trembling with the adrenaline of survival. But it was a shared tremor. The silence between them on the ride was not empty. It was a solid, comfortable thing, a bond forged in mud and fear and victory. Eli unsaddled all Sioux, his movements slow, almost ritualistic. Nasha did the same for her pinto. Every normal chore felt new, charged with significance. He hung the saddle on the rail, his fingers fumbling with the buckle. They met on the small porch, The same place they had sat after the flood. The morning air was cool and sweet, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Nasha stood before him, her face smudged with dirt, a small healing cut on her cheek from the rock spray. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his, reading the night's events in the lines of exhaustion around his own. She reached up, her hand hesitant for the first time, and touched his forehead, brushing back a lock of sweat-dampened hair. The touch was light, a benediction. "I chose you," she whispered, her voice rough with fatigue. "Not because I thought you were a warrior, not for any victory." Her fingers moved from his temple to the swollen, purpled line of his split lip, a touch so light it was barely a sensation. "I chose you," she continued, "because I saw you stand in front of that man, the one who hit you, and you did not hit him back. You did not become the violence that was offered to you. And last night, you stood in front of Pike. You did not offer a weapon. You offered words. You offered law. You chose to build, not to break." Her hand dropped to his shoulder, her grip suddenly fierce. "That is the strength I saw, the strength my grandmother spoke of, the one that bends, but does not break, the one that holds the world together." Eli's throat was thick. He had been seen, in all his fear, all his quiet, all his perceived weakness. He had been seen by her, and she had not found him wanting. She had found him chosen. He raised his own hand, the one she had bandaged, and covered hers on his shoulder. "And I choose you, Nasha," he said, his voice as quiet as hers, but the tremor was gone from it. "I was a man hiding in a fortress of silence. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of the sound of my own voice." He looked into her eyes, holding her gaze. "You came, and you did not shout. You did not demand. You just stood. You showed me that courage doesn't have to be a roar. You showed me it can be the quiet of holding a ladder. It can be the patience of waiting for the wind to die. You gave my silence a purpose." He stepped closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb gently grazing the cut on her cheek. "You were my purpose." The distance between them vanished. He leaned in, and she met him. This was not the first tentative kiss of shared rain and fire. This was a kiss of shared survival, of a truth spoken and received. It was long and deep and slow. There was no hurry. It was a reclaiming. It was the taste of salt and dust and the faint, metallic tang of his own blood. And it was the only thing in the world that was real. Each breath was a question, each response a silent, assenting yes. It was a kiss that spoke of promises kept, of fears faced, of a future that had, against all odds, been secured. His fingers, no longer clumsy, threaded into her thick black hair, his hand cradling the back of her head, holding her gently as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, though he knew she was the strongest person he had ever met. He drew her closer until they were pressed together, his shoulder against hers, his back against her chest, her heart a steady, solid beat against his own. They stood there on the porch for a long time, in the full light of the morning, simply holding each other, a two-person fortress against the world that had tried to break them. The desert wind, which had once sounded so lonely, wrapped around them like a shared blanket. Later, inside the cabin, the embers of the fire from 2 nights ago were pale gray. Eli added new kindling, and soon a small, cheerful fire was crackling, chasing away the last of the night's chill. They sat on the rug, side by side, shoulders touching, watching the flames. They were clean now, having washed the mud and blood away with water from his well. "We should think of a name," Eli said, his voice quiet, almost shy. Nasha turned to him, a question in her eyes. "For the child," he clarified, and the word felt solid, real, in his mouth. "For our child." Nasha was quiet for a moment, her gaze lost in the fire. "In my language," she said, "there is a name. Eskadin Ayanehi. It means, the one who hears the first rain." Eli repeated the name under his breath, stumbling over the syllables. The one who hears the first rain. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yes, that is a good name. They sat in silence, the name of their future hanging in the warm air between them. As the sun reached its zenith, the exhaustion of the last 24 hours settled deep into their bones. Eli stood up, his joints stiff, and held out his hand to her. "You need to sleep," he said. "We need to sleep," she corrected, taking his hand. He led her to his small, simple cot. It was barely big in the small room. This was the final defense. This was the last barrier of his isolation. This bed he had slept in alone for his entire adult life. There was no question, no hesitation. Their consent had been given in the storm. It had been sealed at the well. It was confirmed in the quiet look that passed between them. He pulled back the blanket. She sat, and he sat beside her. He touched her face again, and she leaned into his palm, her eyes closing. He kissed her, softly, a kiss of pure, undiluted tenderness. They removed the last layers of their defense, not just the dusty, torn clothes, but the armor of their solitude. It was an act of profound, mutual trust, of clear and spoken agreement, a quiet promise made in the safety of the afternoon light. It was not a taking, it was a giving, a sharing. Their bodies, weary and scarred, were simply the language of the promise, a physical testament to the merging of their two separate worlds into one. It was a healing, a mending, a quiet, sacred vow that this ground, this small cabin, was now shared territory. The light in the cabin turned to honey as the afternoon wore on. Eli woke first. Nasha was asleep, curled on her side, her breathing deep and even. He lay still, watching her, a feeling of such profound, aching peace settling over him that it was almost a pain. He had never felt this sense of rightness, this sense of home. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he propped himself up on one elbow. He looked at her, at the strong, proud line of her jaw, the relaxed curve of her mouth. He reached out his hand, the one she had bandaged, and laid it gently, palm flat, on her stomach. It was a light, questing touch, a benediction, a prayer, a promise to the future they had fought for. He felt a stir beneath his hand, and he looked up. Her eyes were open, watching him, and then she did something he had never seen before. She smiled. It was not the small, rare twitch of the lips he had seen once or twice. It was a full, slow, radiant smile that transformed her face, that lit her dark eyes from within, that chased away every shadow. She placed her own hand over his, pressing it more firmly against her. "If we have a child," she said, her voice soft and full of that new, smiling warmth. It will learn, she repeated. "From both of us. It will learn from you how to stand still when the world tries to knock you down, how to be the quiet rock." Her thumb stroked the back of his hand, "And it will learn from me," she finished. "When it is time to stop standing still and to step forward." Eli smiled back, his own eyes burning. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of the morning and of a lifetime. Outside, the wind, which had been restless and warning, moved through the blades of the windmill. It turned, as it always did, but the sound was different. The click-clack was gone, replaced by a steady, gentle whir. It was the quiet, constant sound of the desert. Finally, at peace. It was, Eli thought, the sound of a blessing. The fire circle at Arroyo de Cobre was convened again. But this time, the air was different. There was no tension, no challenge. The sun was just setting, and the small fire was a point of warmth against the coming cool, not a stage for interrogation. Mawela came, but she did not come with her warrior escorts. She walked alone, her back straight, her steps slow and deliberate. She walked past the circle of women, past Chayton, and stopped in front of Nasha and Eli, who stood together. She did not speak. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a strand of dark, polished beads, simple, made of wood and perhaps a few pieces of turquoise. Strung on a leather thong, It was old, the beads worn smooth with a lifetime of touch. She pressed the necklace into Nasha's hand. "They were your grandmother's," Mawela said, her voice softer than Eli had ever heard it. "She wore them when she came to this spring to give thanks for the first rain. They belong to the one who now keeps the spring." Nasha closed her hand over the beads, her throat too thick to speak. It was not a gift. It was an inheritance. It was acceptance, passed from one generation to the next. Chayton Greyhawk stepped forward, his face clear in the firelight. He looked at Eli, and the sharp, assessing gaze was gone. In its place was a quiet, earned respect. "My word was given," Chayton said, his voice carrying to the whole circle. "I said I would change it if this man did not run. Last night, the earth shook, and the sound of gunfire was in the air. He did not run." He gestured to the spring, now quiet and undisturbed. He did not hide in the shadows. He did not let others fight for him. When the moment came, he chose to stand in the light, to protect our water. When a gun was raised, he did not raise one in return. He spoke. He used the white man's own weapon, their tangled words of law, to disarm them. He turned and looked at Mawela, his voice firm. "I change my word. I remove my challenge. I support this choice. I will stand as witness for this family." A murmur of assent went through the circle. Mawela nodded, as if this was the last piece she was waiting for. She raised her voice, making a formal proclamation to the small community. "The questions have been answered. The choice has been proven. The child that comes from this," she looked at Nasha, then at Eli. "This child will be one of the people." A collective breath was released. "It will be recognized," Mawela continued, her voice all business now. "A leader setting terms. But there are conditions. This is the price of the bridge." She pointed a finger at Eli. "You, Eli Mercer, you must learn. The child will not be a stranger to our tongue. You will learn the language, so the child can hear it from both sides. You will learn the stories." She then looked at Nasha. "And you, daughter, you will teach. You will hold the ceremony of the first rain. You will bring the child here, to this water, every season. It must know where its life comes from." Eli, who had been standing, simply listening, found his voice. It was clear, and it did not shake. "I accept the conditions," he said. The words felt like a vow. "I will learn the language. I will learn the songs of the rain, and I invite the circle. I invite you all. Every season, the ceremony of the first rain. Let it begin at Dust Creek. Let my home be the place we wait for it together." Mawela stared at him, the offer hanging in the air. It was more than they had asked. He was not just accepting their world, he was inviting it into his own. She gave a single, slow, deep nod. The treaty was sealed. The news of the night's events had traveled faster than they did. When Eli and Nasha had gone to Ocotillo Bend 2 days later for supplies, they found the town buzzing. Silas Reed, the county clerk, his terror having turned to a mix of bureaucratic outrage and self-importance, had filed a formal complaint. He had told everyone of how he was taken in the night, of the dynamite, and of Sheriff Crook's clear, blatant refusal to enforce a federally recognized treaty. Publicly shamed and facing an inquiry from Tucson, Sheriff Harlan Crook resigned his position by the end of the week. Vernon Pike and his men were already gone. When the railroad company received Mr. Reed's frantic telegram about imminent federal treaty violations and potential massive liabilities, a new man was sent down. A man with a legal background, not a gun. The camp at Mesquite Wash was struck, and the new surveyors were told to find a route 10 miles to the north, well clear of any recognized springs. At Arroyo de Cobre, Chayton and the other Apache men erected a large, heavy wooden marker, carving into it the words of the treaty, the date and the seal, a permanent testament, in the white man's own language, that this water was, and would always be, protected. That night, the cabin at Dust Creek was quiet. Eli and Nasha sat at the small, 3-legged table, the oil lamp casting a warm, steady circle of light. Between them lay a piece of heavy paper, the kind Eli used for feed store ledgers. He was drawing, his pencil moving slowly, sketching the lines of his property, the cabin, the well, the ridge. Nasha watched him, and then, taking the pencil, she began to add her own marks. She did not draw fences. She drew a small, wavy line for the path of the flood, and a small circle for the spring at Arroyo de Cobre. She drew a symbol, one he didn't recognize, for the stand of cottonwoods where her grandmother had taught her to listen. Eli labeled his marks in his neat, angular script. Dust Creek. Well, Palo Verde Ridge. Nasha's marks were symbols, pictures, one for the place the Mustangs came for water, one for the rock that held the afternoon sun. They were drawing a map. It was a map of two worlds, of his straight-lined property and her sacred, circular geography. It was the map of the world their child would be born into. It was the path the child would walk, between both shores. When they were finished, they sat looking at it, this new drawn country that belonged to both of them. Nasha picked up the necklace Mahuela had given her, the smooth, dark beads of her grandmother. She held it in her hands, looking at it. Then she looked at Eli. She stood up and moved behind his chair. He sat, watching her as she brought the necklace over his head. She settled the beads around his neck. The wood was cool against his skin. "This is not," she whispered, her voice close to his ear, "to make you one of us." Her hands rested on his shoulders, her fingers pressing into the muscle, a firm, grounding touch. "It is to remember," she said, "that you belong to a promise, that you are part of this land, and this water, and this family, that you will never be alone in the silence again." Eli closed his eyes, his hand coming up to cover hers. He did not need to speak. That night, the sky opened. It was not a violent flood. It was a soft, steady, soaking rain, the kind that sinks deep into the earth, that finds the roots, that brings life. The smell of wet dust and creosote, the perfume of the desert, filled the air, a scent of profound cleansing and relief. They stood on the small porch, hand in hand, listening to the music of the water dripping from the eaves. It was a slow, steady rhythm like a distant drum, a heartbeat. When the desert was thirsty, they had kept the water. When their hearts were afraid, they had kept each other. The bridge had been built, not of iron or wood, but of a quiet, shared courage. And at the end of a long, red dust road, the small cabin stood, no longer a fortress of isolation, but a homestead, a place where a child, one day soon, would learn 2 languages, and 2 songs, and a single, shared definition of strength to stand, and to endure, and to hold fast to the one you love. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please share your thoughts and location in the comments to connect with us. Remember to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.